Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Vince. I've got 20 to 25 minutes to discuss the importance of environmental voting. The Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that does not endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. All we do is find environmentalists who aren't voting and try to turn them into better voters. And I'm going to discuss a little bit why we do that tonight, with the hope that it will also inform you in your work as activists, but also as leaders of faith communities. Because the environmental movement needs to really pay attention to how we express ourselves politically. It's extraordinarily important at this moment in time. So, as Vince mentioned, I have spent well over a decade running political campaigns, big and small. And the thing that always frustrated me most was probably something that many of you are already aware of, if not painfully aware of. And that is this. When you poll likely voters in any election, it could be for mayor of Framingham, president of the United States, governor of Minnesota, anything in between. But you poll likely voters in any election and ask them to list the issues that they care about most. Climate change and other environmental issues are way, way down the list of priorities. And that has a huge impact, not only on whom we elect, but on how policy is made. Because I'll suggest to you that Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, it is going to be really hard to get any politician to lead on a set of issues that voters don't care about. I'll give you an example. Leading into the 2016 presidential election, we polled likely voters in that presidential election. We asked them to list their number one priority and their number two priority. For those of you who might not be able to see, only 2% of likely voters listed climate change or some other environmental issue as their number one priority, and another 2% listed it as their number two priority. How many of you were frustrated by the fact that climate change didn't come up once in the presidential debates? Yeah, this is why. This is why. If voters don't care about a particular set of issues, it's really hard to get politicians to pay attention to them. How many of you were frustrated by the fact that climate change didn't come up in the State of the Union? Maybe you weren't surprised, but yeah. But I'll tell you something. Climate change didn't come up once in the Democratic response to the State of the Union either. And that's not because Joe Kennedy doesn't care about climate change. Of course he does. It's not because there's no difference between Joe Kennedy and Donald Trump. Of course there are plenty of differences. But politicians can't pay attention to an issue that is way, way down the list of voter priorities. They can't. They have limited time and political capital to spend just like anybody. And there's no way anybody's going to push a product for which there is no demand in the marketplace. Now, I'm going to go on for a few more minutes with some of this depressing stuff, but I promise that it's going to end on a much higher, more optimistic, more hopeful note. The reason this is so important gets to what's known as the public voter file. And I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds of how political campaigns are run right now, but I think it is supremely important for anybody who deeply cares about environmental politics. So first, let me say this, and if there is one thing that you remember from my presentation tonight, let it be this. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And if you don't know that now, internalize it, because that is the alpha and omega. It is the lifeblood of how every single political campaign and every policy decision in the United States of America is made. Every single decision. Now, Campaigns only target likely voters. Now, it might seem weird, but think about it this way. Let's say I am running Vince's campaign for governor. How do you think Vince would feel if on election night I came up to him and I said, Vince, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I spent all of our money talking to people who we knew weren't going to vote. Yeah, I would be fired immediately. But remember what I said before. Who you vote for is secret. Whether you vote or not is public record. And so the right way to run a campaign, if all you care about is getting 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November, is to look at the public voter file and see who is likely to show up. And that's what every politician, read policymaker, does. Let's rewind. Let's say it was 9 months before Election Day and I'm running Vince's campaign for governor. The first thing I do, just like the first thing any campaign does, is they look at public voter files. Let's say that you guys aren't registered to vote. All of you over there are registered, but you never ever bother to show up. You're registered over there, but you only vote in presidential elections. You guys, you're pretty good. You vote in presidential elections and midterms, and you vote for everything. You vote for library trustee and dog catcher and everything. Now, I have a limited amount of time until Election Day and a limited amount of money. And Vince is running for governor. Do you think I'm going to bother talking to any of them? No way. Nor am I talking to you guys or you. Remember, it's public record. I know for a fact that all of you never vote in midterm elections. What's more, if I'm running for office during these midterms, and I know I'm never going to bother talking to those people, do you think I care about their opinions? No way. I only poll people who are likely to vote in the election that I care about. Which should be obvious, right? I mean, if I'm Ford Motor Company and I'm trying to sell you a car, I'm not going to poll 3-year-olds, right? I'm not going to do market research on people who aren't old enough to drive. That's the product I'm trying to sell. I need to sell to people who can buy cars and drive, and 3-year-olds can't drive. Well, politicians and policymakers aren't going to bother polling people who they know from public voting records aren't going to show up. And this, at the moment, is a big problem for the environmental movement. Because as I mentioned before on that poll, and there's nothing cherry-picked about that, it's like any poll ever done anywhere for any election. Likely voters list climate change and other environmental issues, no matter how you ask the question, way, way down their list of priorities. And that drives policymaking. Because guys, liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, the one thing that politicians have in common is they go where the votes are. They go where the votes are. And that might sound cynical, but it's not. It's just arithmetic. Like, it's quite literally how elections work. Either you go where the votes are or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And right now, when you poll likely voters for any set of election, these issues are way, way down their list of priorities. But, I told you there was some good news here. What we've realized at the Environmental Voter Project, and some other researchers have realized it as well, is this. The reason so few voters list climate and environmental issues as one of their top priorities is not because too few Americans do. And I'll say that again because it's important. The reason so few of you guys list climate or environmental issues as a top priority is not because too few Americans do. It turns out there are tens of millions of Americans who care so deeply about these issues they list it as one of their top 2 priorities. So why aren't they showing up in polls of likely voters? Because they're not voting. It turns out that there are tens of millions of already registered to vote Americans who deeply care about climate and the environment, who just never show up. They never show up. Now, there's a whole lot of research that goes into why aren't they voting? Why are they voting? Who are these people? Who aren't these people? I don't have the time to go into all of those details. We can discuss it a little bit in the Q&A if you're interested. But I just want to briefly go over some of the numbers, because after I further define this problem, I want to talk to you about some of the solutions. Not only some of the solutions that we use as a big political campaign at the Environmental Voter Project, but some of the solutions that you can use in your faith communities, because they're just as applicable to the work that you use. First, just a little bit to further define this issue. We have identified 15.78 million super environmentalists who are already registered to vote but skipped the 2014 midterm elections. Only 83 million people showed up in 2014, so those 16 million environmentalists would have been nice. To give you some context, about 69% of registered voters voted in the 2016 presidential election. Only about 50% of environmentalists did. If we go back to this election, to 2014, we had about 44% of registered voters vote, but only 21% of environmentalists did. We've got a turnout problem, guys. But as frustrating as that might seem, especially 2 weeks from an extraordinarily important election, I suggest to you that this is potentially very, very good news. Because we live at a moment in time where it's increasingly hard to convince anybody of anything. And changing people's minds, especially about climate change and environmental issues, is extraordinarily hard and extraordinarily expensive. But changing people's actions, changing their behavior, finding people who are already with us, they're already persuaded, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who just aren't voting, and getting them to vote, well, I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But it's a heck of a lot easier. And it's a heck of a lot cheaper. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the people who are trying to convince people who don't care about these issues to start caring about them are doing God's work. And you're going to be hearing from someone shortly who, for my money, is one of the best communicators about this stuff out there. But that also doesn't mean that we shouldn't be grabbing for the low-hanging fruit. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be finding the people who think like us, yet aren't expressing themselves as voters, and making sure that they show up on election day. Because what we are not facing in the climate movement right now is some disease for which we have no cure. That's not what the climate crisis is. Nor is it some enemy that can't be defeated. As Vince mentioned earlier, all we are missing is the political will. That is all we are missing. We have the technological solutions, we have the public health solutions, we even have the policy solutions. We just don't have leaders willing to follow through on them. And the reason that's important is because we have about 200 million registered voters in the United States right now. As I mentioned to you, 83 million showed up to vote in 2014. Only about 4.2 million of them were people who list climate and the environment as one of their top 2 priorities. Believe me, those people don't drive policy. They don't. It was a little bit better in 2016. We had about 10.1 million super environmentalists vote out of 137, 138 million voters. The problem is, we've got another 10 million already registered to vote super environmentalists who don't even show up for presidential elections. But that also, as I said before, is an enormous opportunity. It's an enormous opportunity because these aren't people who need their minds changed. They just need to do something once, twice, 3 times a year, which again, I'm not going to claim is easy, but it's a heck of a lot easier than changing people's minds and trying to get people to care about climate or environmental issues when they don't. This is the low-hanging fruit. This is the least we ought to be doing. Now, very quickly, I'm going to get into some of the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project, but more importantly, how it might be applicable to some of the work that you do. And again, forgive me, I'm going to breeze over a lot of this stuff. At the Environmental Voter Project, we essentially do three things. We use enormous polls of 10 to 15,000 people per state, and then data analytics to zero in on who all the super environmentalists are in each state. I could talk for 40 minutes about these techniques that we use. I'm not going to because I don't have the time. But a really easy way to explain this is we kind of do what insurance companies do. If you apply for life insurance, you give them a whole bunch of information about yourself. How much you drink, how much you smoke, how much you exercise, whether you like to dive off cliffs, things like that. And they use that information and they compare it to all the other people's information that they have, and they throw it into an actuarial table. And not to get morbid, they need to predict how long you're going to live. And if they're off even by a little bit, the global economy tanks. Like, they need to be really, really precise. Well, we do the same thing. We use a lot of data that's out there about you on public voter files, and we poll tens of thousands of people to try to figure out, okay, who are the people who say climate and the environment are one of their top 2 priorities? What are they like? And we build these models. They're called predictive models, and they help us predict who these super environmentalists are. It sounds convoluted, it sounds complicated. It is frighteningly accurate. Frighteningly accurate, and these are how political campaigns now target people. They don't target people by demographic group anymore. They literally target them as individuals. We do this as a way to identify the super environmentalists out there. And then we only talk to the ones who aren't voting. Because remember, what's the one thing I said you can't forget from tonight? Who you vote for is secret. Whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. So unlike most political campaigns, we don't focus on the good voters, we focus on the bad voters. The super environmentalists who aren't voting. And that's where mobilization comes in. And then finally, I won't talk much about habit reinforcement, but we stick with them. What I really want to talk about is this stuff. You don't need to worry about how we reach these people, because this isn't about the Environmental Voter Project tonight. I want to talk to you about this messaging here. What we've realized, and what most behavioral scientists have realized, whether it's in the voter mobilization space or the public health space or anything else, is that usually people don't take an action after making a cost-benefit analysis. It's what behavioral economists would call rational choice theory. Usually it's something called expressive choice theory. Usually you are taking an action because of the way you view yourself or the type of person you want to be. I know that sounds really warm and fluffy, but let me give you an example. My guess is most of you are registered to vote in Massachusetts. I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to whip through this, okay? How many of you voted in the 2016 presidential election? Awesome. I did too. Why? Like, seriously, I mean, in Massachusetts here, we all knew that Hillary Clinton was going to get all the electoral votes. There wasn't a single close congressional race. We have 50 state senators, 150 state reps. I think 4 of those 200 races were close. And out of the 4 statewide ballot questions, the closest was decided by 21 points. I mean, none of you, unless you lived in a cave, couldn't guess what was going to happen. You knew that your one vote had 0 chance of determining the outcome of the election. Yet we weren't alone. There were 4 million people who walked out their doors on Election Day on November 8th, 2016. And my guess is, whether you want to admit it to yourself or not, you weren't voting because you saw some transactional value in your vote. You knew your one vote wasn't going to determine anything. And I know we're not supposed to say that, but we know it. I mean, I probably could have asked you in 2006 whether you were going to vote in 2016, and you would have said, yeah, of course I'm going to vote, because I'm a voter. And believe it or not, that's why most people vote. It's because of the type of person they are. They've decided they wanted to be civically engaged. They've decided they want to do what their peer group is doing. Or they've decided they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their spouse or something like that. And what we've realized is that the way to get someone to vote, the way to get someone to exercise, the way to get someone to vaccinate their children What behavioral scientists have realized is that the way to get people to do that is usually to appeal to that. You use things like peer pressure and social pressure, and I know those have dirty words, those are like sound dirty. But what that means at its core is just that we view ourselves according to certain societal norms. And often we take an action because we are trying to fit into that societal norm. As I think Jim mentioned, there are voter pledges on a lot of your pews. If you fill out a pledge to vote, the Environmental Voter Project will send you a reminder every time you have an election. But that's not why we have those voter pledges there. The reason voter pledges work is not because you need a reminder. It's because most of us, unless you're a sociopath, want to be known as honest and trustworthy people. And if you make a promise to do something and someone reminds you of that promise, your likelihood of doing it jumps 5%. That might not seem like a lot, but believe me, in politics, that is everything. It is everything. We've also realized that even people who don't vote want to be known as good voters. So you know what we do? We send them letters saying, hey, who you vote for is secret. Whether you vote or not is public record. We hope you remember to be a good voter on Tuesday, and we might follow up with you after the election to find out how your experience was. Is it a little heavy-handed? Yeah. It's sending turnout through the roof. Now, how can you use this in your faith communities? As leaders who often describe and set societal norms, it's extraordinarily important for us as environmentalists to begin viewing being a voter as one of the highest forms of environmental citizenship. There are a whole bunch of things that we in the environmental movement do that are enormously impactful. We've changed the way we eat, we've changed the way we get to work, we've changed the way we consume electricity, all of which are really hard and really important. But we are not voting. You study people who think gun rights are important, they vote like it's their job. It's one of the highest ways that they express themselves as gun owners. And in the environmental movement, we need to realize that if we are living by a set of values and not showing up on election day, when all we are missing in the climate movement is political will, we're hiding our light under a bushel. I mean, what value does any of your environmental vision and your environmental opinions have if you aren't showing up at the one time when it makes a difference? It's so important that people understand that. And in your faith communities, in your congregations, people are looking for guidance on how to be good Jews, good Muslims, good Christians. They are looking for guidance on how to be good environmentalists. And the act of voting has to be seen as one of the highest forms of environmental citizenship. Because to close, I want to reiterate, I'm not going to go over where we are. You can pledge to vote, you can volunteer. I want to reiterate how important it is to be a loud and proud environmental voter. Peer pressure works. I've seen congregations have everybody stand up if they intended to vote in that election, so that everybody could look around and see all the people who were standing up intending to vote. And believe me, it's powerful, and there's very good behavioral science showing that it works. I want to close with just two things. First, please, under no circumstances, leave tonight and say, oh, I heard this MIPandL Stinnett guy talk, and he said environmentalists don't vote, and isn't that awful? Guys, I know it's frustrating, but this is an enormous opportunity. You know what would be really bad news? Is if I told you, hey, we've polled a whole bunch of people and it turns out no one cares about climate change or environmental issues. That would be bad. That would be really, really bad news. Because changing that number of minds so completely in this weird, post-truth world we live in would be impossible. But that's not what we're living through. There is, close to a silent green majority out there. There are tens of millions of Americans who are already registered to vote and care so deeply about these issues that they list it as one of their top 2 priorities. They just ain't showing up when it matters. And when I say they, I mean us. I am confident, I am 100% confident that people in your faith communities, maybe people in this room, vote every now and then, or they vote for president, and maybe in the midterms. We need to vote all the time. And that gets to the second and final point I want to make. Remember, politicians go where the votes are. They go where the votes are. And I know it sounds like really hard to hear me say that, but it is not cynical. It's just democracy. It's just democracy. And no matter whom we elect, even the world's greatest environmental leader is not going to be able to spend her or his political capital on something that voters don't deeply care about. But here's the good news. The really good news is no matter whom we elect, they will follow where voters lead them. I think it was Vince or maybe Jim and I were talking about this earlier. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island is fond of saying that he has 7 or 8 Republican colleagues in the US Senate who would lead on pricing carbon. They would lead on it if the votes were there for them. This is not some huge moral litmus test issue for conservatives. Politicians go where the votes are. And I guarantee you that if all of us woke up tomorrow morning and the front page of the New York Times said, likely voters in the upcoming midterm elections list climate change as their number 3 priority, if we saw that headline tomorrow morning, the whole world would change overnight. Whole world would change overnight, and we wouldn't have elected a single new person. Because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. Nothing. And so, as we're 2 weeks away from the election, as early voting has already begun here in Massachusetts, one of the messages that you can bring back to your congregations and your faith communities is that if they deeply care about creation, if they deeply care about climate change and environmental injustice and pollution and children's health and all of these issues, they have to show up. Even if they write their dog's name in on the ballot, they have to show up. Because simply by voting, you become a part of that, unfortunately, very small group of Americans that drives policy. Because politicians really don't care about what non-voters think. And remember what I said, who you vote for is secret, whether you vote or not is public record. They are only going to look at people who vote, they are only going to poll people who vote, and those are the people who are going to drive policy. Thank you again so much. Really enjoyed being here.